Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. This episode is about the Lady Juliana, part of the second fleet of convicts to Australia, which left from Plymouth in England on the 29th of June in 1789, carrying approximately 226 female convicts on board to be sent to the new colony in Port Jackson of New Holland. It wasn't known as Australia until 1803. The Lady Juliana was to be the first of the Second Fleet ships to leave English waters. An account of their voyage was mostly compiled from a journal by John Nichols, who came aboard the Lady Juliana as a steward. It is such a detailed and most interesting account. The tales of the Lady Juliana's voyage to Australia are not all known widely. Here are some of the stories mentioned in Nichols' journal, as well as some pieces from Ralph Clarke and David Collins upon arrival in Port Jackson. Now, there was a delay in getting the Lady Juliana loaded and on its way initially. There was approximately a 6-month delay, with the female convicts who were gathered up from all the jails around London, including the notorious Newgate prison, which was full at the time. It is believed that 108 of the female prisoners were from Newgate. As from previous episodes of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts, we know that the Newgate prison in London was an awful prison, overcrowded and unhygienic. In February of 1789, the female convicts from Newgate prison were loaded onto another ship and taken to a point eastern the Thames called Galleon's Reach, awaiting cargo to be loaded and repairs to the Lady Juliana. This would be quite a long wait, as we know there was a 6-month delay. In March 1789, more of the women joined them. On the 7th of May, the Lady Juliana sailed to Spithead near Portsmouth. This is where all the female convicts were loaded onto the Lady Juliana. There were female convicts brought in from the country areas of England, as well as other parts of the UK. As Nichols was from Scotland originally, he talks about a Scottish female convict who took her own life before they set sail. This deeply upset John Nichols, as he tried so many different things to try and lift the mood and spirit of this woman. Unfortunately, all efforts failed, for whenever he brought up Scotland, she would weep uncontrollably. There was nothing that he could do in the end to show her that there was so much to live for if she would just give it a chance. Another of the female convicts mentioned in Nichols' journals was a Sarah Dorsett. It must have been a well-known fact in London at this time. All the female felons in the Newgate prison were being transported. There were a husband and wife who went to Newgate prison looking for their lost child. They had listed their child as missing, but unfortunately, they most likely knew that she must have ended up at the prison. Before the females were transported, they quickly went to Newgate prison to check for their daughter, Sarah Dorsett. Word got to Nichols. Aboard the holding ship, they were looking for a young woman, Sarah Dorsett. After asking around, he found out that yes, she was on the ship awaiting transportation. They organised for the parents to come and see her before the ship sailed. Nichols records the heartbreaking moment when the parents reunited with their daughter for the last time. The mother burst into tears and Sarah fainted. The father could not even get words out. It was such a sad situation. But there were so many sad situations. He could not record all of them. He also mentions 4 female convicts escaped the night before the sail, where one of their husbands rowed them to shore. After a quick look around, they were unable to find the women and the ship sailed without them. It is known that there were 37 male crew members on board. Nichols writes that once the ship had sailed out of English waters, that most of the crew had found a female convict they chose as their sea wife, or someone who they were intimate with. Surprisingly, Nichols tells how most of these matchings turned into lifelong relationships, as many married upon arrival at Port Jackson. Nichols also tells of his own love story between himself and Sarah Whitlam, an 18-year-old country girl from Lincolnshire who was strapped to the outside of a coach. The journey from Lincoln to London was 230 kilometres, and this was during winter. She had a seat in which she sat on, but being strapped on the outside of a coach for 230 kilometres would not have been a comfortable ride in winter. Nichols says that they were very much in love, and she also became pregnant while on board the Lady Juliana with his child, like many other of the females coupled up on the voyage. Nichols mentions many other women aboard the Lady Juliana, including Elizabeth Barnsley, who was a well-to-do thief. She had people visiting her on the ship before they sailed to ensure that she had money and other comforts to see her through to Port Jackson. Nichols described her as a noted swindler, as were her people for generations. Her husband Thomas was on the Neptune, which would later sail in the Second Fleet to Port Jackson also. Elizabeth Barnsley was generous with the other female convicts and had quite an entourage willing to please her for whatever they could get to make their own lives better on the voyage. She was also able to talk Lieutenant Thomas Edgar into allowing the ladies to wear their own clothing aboard the ship while at sea. Lieutenant Thomas Edgar had stashed the female convicts' clothes away, as he told Nichols that the poor creatures would need them once they arrive at Port Jackson. Those who didn't have their own clothing would wear the convict dress. It is well known that the female convicts aboard the Lady Juliana had many perks compared to the women of the Lady Penrhyn and any of the other convicts on the First Fleet. The women of the Lady Juliana were not chained as some of the previous convicts were. They were not watched over as often. They were able to freely come up on deck, as well as stop off at the various ports. Nichols mentions how some of the ladies purchased crucifixes when they went out on the port. They used these then to trick people on the land into giving them presents, thinking that they were God-fearing women. Many of the women were making money from men when they stopped off at the ports. It was quite encouraged for the women to stop off and have encounters with men, both for money and also to populate the colony upon their arrival with babies. It was also encouraged that men from the ports could come on board the ship freely. Many of the working women from London continued to work aboard the Lady Juliana, either on the ship or going out at each port. Some of the women who weren't in this line of business quickly got into the business to make money. We know that Captain Aiken also brought aboard the ship quite a large amount of fabric. He had at least 25 of the female convicts making shirts in which they could sell upon arrival at Port Jackson, as clothing was such a necessity in the colony now. Upon leaving Santa Cruz in Tenerife, 2 slave ships followed them to their next stop at Sao Tiago. It is known that they were following them for the ladies. The next stop was Rio de Janeiro, where they were there for 8 weeks. This was really good for the convicts, as they were able to keep getting fresh fruit and fresh air. They were able to make money, and it made everybody happier overall. If only all of the ships had this luxury. It is understood that many of the female convicts became pregnant after encounters with the African slave ships. The women of England had donated money for children's bed linen, in the hope that many of the women would become mothers. In fact, the Lady Juliana had quite a lot of mothers on board that ship. Some had their children when they were on board, and some gave birth while they were on board, and many gave birth after arriving into Port Jackson. Nichols mentions Elizabeth Barnsley again. When there were so many women on board needing assistance, she became more of a midwife, both on the ship on the way to Port Jackson and also after arrival. She was like a queen among the female convicts. The Lady Juliana was known as the Ship of Mothers. It is also known that many of the females were able to get access to liquor, and they had a lot of food. It was like a big party ship. It was wild at times on board while they were waiting for the Lady Juliana to leave port. A lot of men from the ports came on board, and the officers made no attempts to stop the encounters. The ship itself was kept quite clean. It must have been the many hours spent aboard not doing very much, waiting for the Lady Juliana's repairs. Altogether, they were there for 45 days in Rio de Janeiro before they left for Cape of Good Hope, where they were there for 19 days. Although it wasn't all fun and games, this is where they encounter the Guardian. The Guardian left England in the September of 1789, headed for Port Jackson. It was carrying livestock, crops and other supplies that were desperately needed by the colony. The colony had been struggling to survive ever since they arrived in the January of 1788. The Guardian was captained by an Edward Riou. He began his career at the age of 12, working as a midshipman on the Discovery, which Captain James Cook used on his third and final voyage. The Guardian took on supplies at the Cape of Good Hope in December of 1789 and was heading to Port Jackson, where the new settlement was eagerly awaiting it. Captain Riou was only 26 years old when he joined the Guardian. Within only 2 weeks of the voyage, on Christmas Eve, 24th of December, they entered a dark fog. They had sent some boats out to clear some of the ice that was in their way, but unfortunately, in their travels they hit a large island of ice, causing the water to come in through the hull immediately. The crew tirelessly tried to pump water out of the ship and try and keep her afloat, many of them losing hope and wanting to leave the sinking ship immediately. By morning, Captain Riou decided he would let anyone who wished to leave the ship leave. They gathered up the small boats and anyone who wanted to abandon ship got on board, including one of the men who was meant to be the new reverend in the colony. Captain Riou was not going to leave his ship while there was a man on board. He hands a letter to a Thomas Clements and it reads, HMS Guardian, December 25th, 1789. If any part of the officers or crew of the Guardian should ever survive to get home, I have only to say their conduct after the fatal stroke against an island of ice was admirable and wonderful in everything that relates to their duties, either as private men or in His Majesty's service. As there seems to be no possibility of my remaining many hours in this world, I beg leave to recommend to the consideration of the Admiralty a sister who, if my conduct or service should be found deserving any memory, their favour might be shewn to, together with a widowed mother. I am, Sir, remaining, with great respect, your ever obedient servant, E. Riou. The remaining crew and the convicts stayed behind to try and keep the boat from sinking. Captain Riou organised for whoever could help to send cargo and guns over the side to try and lighten the load and keep the boat from sinking. Little did they know that it would be several months until they were rescued. During this time, some of the men on board got into the liquor supplies. There was many scuffles and fights that broke out as many of them became drunk and disorderly. Despite threats of throwing them overboard, they continued the ill behaviour. But Captain Riou didn't let this stop him. He kept them all in line like a true captain. Captain Riou kept a logbook of the events that happened after the Guardian was struck by ice. It has been stated that the logbook was a powerful and touching document reflecting the events following the Guardian striking the ice. The writings prove Riou's relentless strength in keeping the Guardian afloat, despite many of the crew taking boats and leaving him behind. Some of the men who escaped from the Guardian, including a Thomas Clements, were finally picked up by a French merchant ship, the Countess of Brittany. Around 60 men remained with Captain Riou on board the Guardian. They all survived. At one point in the logbook, on Wednesday the 10th of February, across the page in extremely unsteady handwriting, Riou had simply scrawled, losing. His handwriting had become reduced to a scribble due to a hand injury sustained by trying to offload cargo in the hopes to keep the ship afloat. An American vessel came along shortly after and was able to tow the Guardian ship to shore. They tried to recover everything that they could from the ship, including some of the livestock. When the Juliana stopped in at the Cape of Good Hope, they needed to take on board everything that was left over from the Guardian that was salvageable. One of the female convicts was named a shepherdess. She was to look after the sheep that had been taken in from the Guardian ship. They were there for 19 days. They also took on some of the men who were left over from the ship, including the convicts. This was their last stop before arriving in Port Jackson. After Ryu saw off the Lady Juliana, he came into contact with the Neptune, the Surprise and the Scarborough. He received such a shock in seeing the way that the convicts were treated, he sent a notice through to Governor Phillip to advise of the cruelty the convicts encountered. But he does recommend that the convicts that stayed aboard with him on the Guardian during that perilous time be given a pardon if at all possible. They were very helpful, and many of them, if not all of them, were given a pardon upon arriving at Port Jackson. Governor Phillip commended Captain Ryu for saving the Guardian. The Guardian was repaired and later sailed away. Captain Ryu was hailed for his heroism and bravery. Songs and poems were written about the Guardian disaster, which was a sensational story in Europe. There were many sketches of the dramatic disaster of the Guardian ship, showing people escaping on boats and abandoning the ship. Shortly after, he received passage back to Britain. On arriving back in Britain, he was wildly popular after the stories of the Guardian had reached back home. He was even promoted to Master and Commander in 1790, but it wouldn't be until the French Revolutionary Wars where he really needed to step up. He was then sent to the Battle of Copenhagen. Unfortunately, this is where he loses his life in 1801. His last moments were standing with his men. Notice of this from Lieutenant Colonel William Stewart, commanding the soldiers of the 48th Regiment. He recorded that Ryu was sitting on a gun, was encouraging his men, and had been wounded in the head by a splinter. He had expressed himself grieved at being thus obliged to retreat, and nobly observed, "What will Nelson think of us?" His clerk was killed by his side, and by another shot, several Marines, while hauling on the main brace, shared the same fate. Ryu then exclaimed, "Come then, my boys, let us all die together." The words were scarcely uttered when the fatal shot served him in two. There was quite a welcoming party in Botany Bay and Port Jackson, awaiting the first ship since the first fleet arrived. They were hoping it was the Guardian, who was coming with all the supplies they needed in a starving colony. A boat was sent out with John White, the surgeon from the First Fleet, and Lieutenant Watkin Tench on board to see if they could render assistance to get them into Port Jackson. When it was found that this was not indeed the Guardian store ship that they so badly needed, and that it was a female convict ship, many of them became quite angry and frustrated. The colony was starving, and it wasn't food that arrived, it was women. Lieutenant Ralph Clarke is famous for calling them the damned whores. The frustration really took it out on them. One of the seamen who witnessed the ship coming into Port Jackson said that all the women looked fresh-faced and well. The colony was still needing many women, so in reality they needed the women to arrive. However, with food being a scarcity, they really did need more food for the colony, not more mouths to feed. Although the Lady Juliana was carrying some supplies and livestock, it wasn't enough for this struggling colony. Rations would be stretched further. We hear of another story, a Catherine White, also known as Katie White, sent on the Lady Juliana and then to Norfolk Island on the Surprise, as so many other women were. There is note of Katie White being with a Mary Higgins in the diaries of Ralph Clarke. Lieutenant Ralph Clarke was stationed on Norfolk Island managing them. Apparently the women had travelled together on the Lady Juliana. They got on like a house on fire, Ralph says. He mentions Katie White was about 10 years younger than Mary. Good-looking women, but great thieves. Unfortunately for the girls, though, they were caught stealing corn from one of the areas where they were working, on the public fields. They were spotted by Mr. Dodge out on Charlotte Field, now known as Queensborough. The two ladies were placed in irons and put into Clarke's new jail. With the heavy irons, they lay overnight in the dirt, waiting for the dawn. Another one of the convicts aboard the Lady Juliana was an Elizabeth Steele. She was also known as Betty. It has been recorded that she was mute by visitation of God, also meaning that she was deaf. There wasn't much mentioned about Betty on the voyage. Once she arrived in Port Jackson, she was part of the many of the convicts that were sent to Norfolk Island. Reverend Richard Johnson travelled to Norfolk Island and married any of the couples who wished to be married. At Norfolk Island, she married one of the other male convicts, James Mackey. They successfully farmed a leasehold until their sentences expired. It is noted that Elizabeth returned to Sydney in 1794. However, she died the following year, aged 29. She was one of many people buried at the old Sydney burial ground. Apparently, many of the old cemeteries have now been built over the top of. In 1991, her headstone was discovered when there was some digging maintenance done underneath Town Hall Station, when Town Hall Station underwent major restoration works in order to lay new stormwater pipes. Archaeologists were able to find some skeletal remains. However, on testing these, they were not Betty's remains. There were many people that are still buried underneath Town Hall Station, but it is quite interesting that they found Betty's headstone. Among the many female convicts sent to Port Jackson, there were actually 4 Mary Williams, 2 of which were on the Lady Juliana. There are many noted women from the Lady Juliana, including a Rachel Turner, who the surgeon John White was very fond of. They became very close and even had a son together. Although when John White had to go back to England, Rachel was not able to come with him. John White did, however, take his son with him when he left in 1794. Andrew Douglas White was raised by the sister of his father's friend, Lieutenant Henry Waterhouse. He did his schooling in England and joined the Royal Engineers as a second lieutenant on the 1st of July 1812. He was involved in the Battle of Waterloo. Andrew was the only Australian on the Waterloo battlefield. He received no injury and on returning to England received his Waterloo Medal. Later on, he returns to Sydney in 1822, reunited with his mother. He hadn't been to Australia in 30 years. He did not stay in Australia and ended up back in England in 1824, where he becomes second captain in the Royal Engineers in 1826. He later visited Australia in 1833 and married Mary Ann Mackenzie, who was a niece of Lieutenant Colonel John Piper. Unfortunately, he dies in Australia in 1837, leaving no heir, although he is recognised as being the first Australian to become a decorated soldier. Rachel went on to marry a Thomas More. Thomas More was an early European settler in Australia. Born in Lesbury, Northumberland, in 1792 he arrived in Australia as a ship's carpenter aboard the Britannia. He meets Rachel in 1792. However, he continues to go out to sea for another 5 years. When he comes back in 1796, he marries Rachel Turner in 1797. There is also note that he becomes a magistrate as well. In 1809, he is awarded 1,300 acres of land along the Georges River, naming the property Moorebank. They became one of the wealthiest couples in town, and the suburb Moorebank was named after them. Moore became the first citizen of Liverpool and was commissioned by Governor Macquarie to oversee the building of the Liverpool Township. By the mid-1820s, Moore was residing in Liverpool and leasing out the Moorebank estate. Moore died without an heir in 1840, leaving his 6,400-acre Moorebank estate to the Church of England. The church leased parts of the land to new arrivals in Australia, particularly farmers and gardeners. Rachel was living with Thomas in Liverpool until her death in 1838. We also know of Elizabeth Parry, who arrived on the Lady Juliana. She married James Roos, who arrived on the Scarborough shortly after the Lady Juliana arrived. James Roos was emancipated shortly after arriving. He only had 18 months of his sentence left. Governor Arthur Phillip gave him a land grant, stating that he had been bred for farming. He was given an allotment close to Rose Hill, which is now Parramatta. Elizabeth and James made a really wonderful life for themselves. James Roos was the first man to be able to get land granted to him in the new colony. He was also the first convict emancipated, as was Elizabeth Parry. They later sold their farm near Rose Hill for an allotment near the Hawkesbury River. Unfortunately, due to flooding that ruined his farm and ended up bankrupt, James Roos was later working as a seaman as well as a farm overseer. He and Elizabeth retired into Campbelltown area, and this is where they are both buried. The Lady Juliana may have been a controversial convict ship, but the women did so much for this country, including Mary Wade, who was only 11 years old when she was transported. She was the youngest in the Second Fleet. She went on to have so many descendants, many of them well-known figures, even Australia's former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. It is quite interesting. The Lady Juliana ship was dubbed the Ship of Mothers. Many of the women aboard the Lady Juliana went on to have children who became prominent figures in the community. As for John Nichols and his love with Sarah Whitlam, it didn't end as he had hoped. He wanted to marry Sarah as soon as they got to Port Jackson. However, he still had time in his stewardship and needed to go back out to sea again. Upon arriving in England sometime later, he was to check back with Sarah and find out if she was still waiting for him. Unfortunately, she had moved on, as so many of the women had to in order to survive. Sadly, this love story didn't end as hoped, but others went on to have many generations of Australians. There were only 5 female convicts that died aboard the Lady Juliana, which is an amazing contrast compared to the men on the Neptune, Surprise, and Scarborough. The ladies aboard the Juliana were not whores. Some of them may have made money in untraditional ways, but they did what they had to do, as so many convicts did at the time, to survive. If it weren't for many of these convicts, a lot of us would not be here now. It is really good to see that these stories have survived more than 200 years, and we intend to keep these stories coming, to keep their memories alive, and that of historic Australia. Thank you for watching this episode of Lady Juliana. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe and keep all notifications on. Stay tuned for our next episode, being the Death Fleet. What happened on the Neptune, the Surprise and the Scarborough?